Hello guys, welcome back. Today is a fantastic day as it is the official biblical Yom Teru'ah. Civil Israel celebrated their Rosh Hashanah on Monday. Monday and Tuesday. It's a double holiday in Israel and it falls under the auspice of Rosh Hashanah, literally in Hebrew, head of the year. Does the Bible actually say that the new year begins in the 7th month? No, it actually says in Exodus 12 verse 2 that this will be the beginning of month 2. This month, which is the month of Aviv, speaking of, is the first month of the year to you. First question before we speak about Yom Teruah is, how did that happen? The background to how Israel actually started to celebrate Rosh Hashanah instead of Yom Teruah has got a very interesting backstory. We know that the nation of Israel was in exile in Babylon starting 522 BC, and they returned to the land roughly 586 BC. And in that period of 70 years during which they were exiled from the physical land of Israel, we know that a lot of changes has happened. First of all, they came back with a different script, a different alphabet. They actually came back with a different language. Even modern Israel, even today, most of what we learn about the Hebrew language has its roots in Assyria, in Babylon. And that we know that in the time that Yeshua came to earth, this kind of double script, this amalgamation of a pictographic Hebrew script had been fused with this Assyrian version of it. And a lot has been lost. We know that the pictures has been lost, and all of these pictures contained meaning that helped us to understand some of the rudimentary meaning that over time got completely different means. They got more philosophical and they got more religious, ironically, because modern day Israel is not all that religious. But what we want to speak about today is the incredibly strange but important festival of Yom Teruah. Now we'll read about Yom Teruah in Leviticus 23, and I want us to quickly open the Bible and check that out. In verse 1 it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the appointed times of Yahweh, which you are to proclaim as set apart gatherings, my appointed times, not the feast of the Jews, not the feasts of Israel." Yahweh says it is mine, it belongs to me. Okay, very important. My appointed times are these. And then it starts telling us, first of all, about the weekly Sabbath. It says 6 days you need to work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a set apart gathering. You do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwellings. These are the appointed times of Yahweh. Again, not the feast of the Jews, not the appointed times of the Jews, not the appointed times of Messianic believers. They are the appointed times of Yahweh, set apart gatherings, which you are to proclaim in their appointed times. And then it goes on from Leviticus 23 verse 5. It starts telling you about the feast of Pesach, the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of first fruits. It continues speak about the feast of Shavuot, the feast of harvest. And then finally, we get to the 7th month. And this we read in verse 23. Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th new moon, on the first day of the new moon, you have a rest, a remembrance of Teruah, a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work, and you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yahweh." And then from verse 26-27, it continues to speak about Yom HaKippurim, which follows in 10 days' time. The question is, what exactly is going on here? The Bible is not giving us an awful amount of information about this day. First of all, let's look at the word Yom Teruah. Now, Yom Teruah literally means a day of sounding. In certain circles, it is known as the Feast of Trumpets, and for very good reason. In the book of Numbers 10, verse 10, it speaks about sounding the shofar at the appointed times with the sighting of the moon. But the actual word Yom Teruah means a day of sounding. This could be a sounding of the voice, it could be a sounding of the trumpet, the flute, the ram's horn, but it means it is a day that you proclaim by making a noise, by actually sounding into the skies, into the atmosphere, something that proclaims a very specific day. You see, the weekly Sabbath is extremely easy in a sense. You do 6 days of work, and by the way, the Hebrew names of days are literally just day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. But when you get to the 7th day, it has a name called Shabbat. You live 6 days, and on the 7th day, you rest, you breathe, you accept the beautiful gift that you do not have to be productive in that day. Same applies when you get to the first month of the year, which in our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, falls around March or April. It's very easy. You count 14 days from the beginning of the month, and then you have the Passover. Yes, you need to prepare for the Passover from the 10th day of the month. The moon is sighted and you count your days. Then you have the Passover, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you have the Feast of First Fruits. Then literally from that Sunday, within the Feast of First Fruits, you count 50 days. The biblical tradition is called the counting of the Omer. Okay, the counting of the Omer, and that lasts for 50 days. And again on a Sunday, on the 6th of Sivan in the 3rd Hebrew month, you have another feast called the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot in Hebrew. You have to count 50 days. But when you get to the 7th month, in which 3 very important feasts happen, there is a difference, because if you have to celebrate an appointed time on the first day of a month, this would imply that you would be waiting ready for the moon. The only way that the Hebrew people could indicate or delineate the beginning of a month were to sight the moon. Now imagine you have to hold a feast on the first day of a festival. That means you have to sit ready with everything that needs to happen on that festival in a state where nothing else matters. Very curious. Now, if you look at Matthew 24, and I think when time allows us later, we can go into the detail of what Yeshua actually speaks of regarding this day. But this day is a day where we literally make a noise. It is the name of the day. Now follow this. When the nation of Israel was taken into exile to Babylon, the immediate thing that happened is they were unable to sight the moon from the Mount of Olives, which had been the tradition. And then a very interesting change occurred. There was a rabbi by the name Hillel II, and he basically calculated the dates on which all of the appointed times would fall. And he kind of post-dated that into the future, and even to this day, Israel lives on that calendar. You can see what happened is that natural dependency on God to wait for the moon, to actually be ready to wait, that has fallen away. And one can understand that them living in Babylon under a different reign, it wasn't possible for them to say, hey, the new moon had been sighted, this is the beginning of the month. And more curiously so with the feast of Yom Teru'ah, the day of sounding, because now the only way to indicate the beginning of the month had been to actually sit and wait and to see the moon and then make this curious noise unto Yahweh. Interestingly, the Bible doesn't say an awful lot about what this feast actually entails. It tells us in the name you have to make a noise, you have to sound, you have to proclaim something, and then there's an offering made by fire. I have no idea what it means. Sometimes in our world it just means for us maybe just to have a barbecue, but I don't know what it means to do an offering of fire unto Yahweh. We know it's a day of rest. We know it's a day declared by Yahweh that you are allowed to stop. You're allowed just to breathe, to think, to spend time with God, just to spend time in the Word, with family. And it also says it is a set-apart gathering, a Mikra Kodesh. And by the way, all of the feasts has this one thing in common. They are gatherings that are different. They are, quote-unquote, a calling out, which is different to all of the days of the week, which is different to all of the days of the year. So this day, after the moon had been sighted last night from all over the world, is a different day. Today is Yom Teru'ah. Yes, in Jewish tradition 2 days ago, it had been the New Year. But sadly, that New Year, that Rosh Hashanah, had come to replace Yom Teru'ah. And what makes me so sad about that is within the feast of Yom Teru'ah, and especially when you look at the words of Jesus when he's spoken about Yom Teru'ah, there's so much messianic meaning almost hidden within it, and that had been done away with. So even as we celebrate this incredibly different, incredibly curious feast of Yom Teru'ah, we remember the sadness that this day had been quintessentially replaced. My prayer for all of us is that this day, as we commemorate it, as we become aware that God is operating on a different calendar to that of our own, my prayer is that we would slowly but surely get into the rhythms of beginning to understand what God is busy doing. We will start looking at the calendar of Yahweh as time progresses, so that we can get a feeling for what God is busy doing, what is going on when we almost pull back and have a bird's eye view of the Hebrew calendar and start seeing, are there any patterns that we can spot? Are there any numbers that repeat from which we can derive wisdom? May you be blessed. May this Yom Teru'ah be a time of refreshment and a time of really getting in sync with God as we await 10 days from today to the feast of Yom HaKippurim, or the Day of Coverings.